Welcome back. We're days away from seeing the Democratic presidential hopefuls square off on back-to-back nights. Tension between the United States and Iran grew more this week, raising questions about the next move from the U.S. And all the floodwater is gone, though there is still work to be done, as well as things to consider for the future. All things we'll talk about this morning with former Rock Island Mayor Mark Schwiebert and Democrat and former Iowa Republican Party Chair Steve Grubbs. Always great to see you both.
Good to be here.
So we're going to start with what we've all had to deal with in the greater Quad Cities area. That is the flooding. The immediate Quad Cities spent more than 90 days at some form above flood stage, about 2 months at major flood stage. We saw what happened in downtown Davenport, Moline, Muscatine, and Buffalo also had serious problems. So what course of action should be considered in the Quad Cities, specifically in terms of recovery and to prevent this from happening again? Steve, I know one of your business ventures actually dealt with this directly.
Yeah, we at Paradigm, we were flooded for 4 or 5 weeks. We reopened, but traffic downtown is still very light, which is affecting all the businesses. So we would encourage people, businesses are open, go downtown. So
we know that just in terms of a community support issue, but in terms of
yes,
future planning sort of things.
Yeah,
I mean, there was the note from the city that basically said that their flood planner is all about infrastructure, and they're really not. It seemed sort of distant when it said in terms of not caring for the businesses downtown.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it sort of feels like a disheartening kind of statement.
So a couple of things. The first thing that should happen is the city and business leaders need to have a news conference and explain that they do intend to protect the entire downtown businesses and infrastructure. So those businesses right now that are considering whether to reopen or not, so they have confidence to reopen, they know that their business will be protected. So that's number one. Number two, and I know they're working on this, we need a plan, and there's a pretty good plan coming into place that will protect downtown businesses with something semi-permanent and reliable from something like this happening again. Because even though this is a once in a 1,000-year flood, it seems like we're having them every 10
20
years.
years or something.
Yeah.
And Mark here is former mayor of Rock Island. Rock Island is one of the places that actually has a flood wall in place, and so it's a different approach here.
Sure, and I think that there's been a sort of a philosophical difference between the two sides of the river that goes back a long ways. We have had a very good experience in Rock Island with the flood protection system that was put in about 50 years ago and was modified about 25 years ago when the Jumers Boat Works came. Before that, we had a solid flood wall, and we removed the flood wall in order to get access to the river for the boat works. And during that period of time, we put in something like Steve is talking about here, a series of posts between which you can drop gates in order to protect the downtown.
It raises the flood wall, essentially.
That's right. So essentially, you have access to the river when the water's within its banks, and then you have protection from the flood at relatively short notice and in a reliable way when the waters get out of their banks. And with climate change, I think we're going to see these, as Steve said. We're seeing 100-year floods, 500-year floods now every 5-10 years, and it really does mean we're going to have to take a little more dramatic measures to try to protect ourselves from that. I think one of the key things we need to keep in mind is there's a lot of sense in allowing the flood plains to work in order to accommodate the nature and its flow of the river. At the same time, where we have developed areas, we really need to protect those areas, and that's, I think, where the kind of a removable flood protection system that is semi-permanent can work very well.
Sounds like you're both confident that something positive will come out of this for the long term.
Absolutely.
All right, let's move on to something going from extremely local to extremely international here. There is rising tension regarding Iran. The country announced this week it increased production to enrich uranium. This would be viable for nuclear power generators, not nuclear warheads. However, this would be more than the limits originally established under the nuclear deal that the Trump administration withdrew from. Things got worse when Iran shot down a U.S. drone this week. The U.S. claims the drone was over international water. Iran maintains it was flying over the Strait of Hormuz. It claims it's sovereign territory. This relationship, of course, has been horrible for decades and getting worse. There was the attempt to possibly retaliate on Thursday night, which we know was called back at the last minute by the president. I guess what is the likelihood this will escalate into prolonged military action here, and what concerns are there? Should there be here, Mark?
Well, I think it's very concerning. It is a kind of consistently unstable part of the world, the Middle East, and has been for the last, well, certainly since World War II. And I think it's important for us to try to approach this thing in a manner that takes things incrementally. I think the steps to try to back Iran away from its attempts to build up nuclear capacity were meaningful in a productive direction. Their government has been a little more moderate than some of the preceding governments. They still have, of course, the Ayatollah at the top, yeah. Who unfortunately tends to be pretty extreme. But I think we need to try to cultivate more moderate leadership in Iran so that we can make them an ally once again and back them away from some of the engagements they've got in terrorism in other parts of the world, which is certainly something we need to be concerned about. But the way you do that isn't probably by calling off a deal and then escalating the rhetoric. I think the Trump administration's plan is basically to wear them down with the sanctions, and of course Iran can't really tolerate that because their economy is really in a tailspin right now. So I think what we're going to see with them is probably the intention of increasing the rhetoric a little bit, and hopefully cooler minds will prevail and diplomacy can will out.
Well, when we've seen countries struggling economically, sometimes they do lash out militarily and aggressively too. Steve, how concerning is this to you regarding Iran here?
No, I'm not overly concerned about Iran doing any real damage to the United States.
But this is a true power in the Middle East when we look at nations.
Sure,
it's not just one of the smaller countries. This is a power.
Yeah, that may be the case. I'm still not concerned with Iran doing any real damage to the United States. And I thought the president's response Thursday night in choosing not to move ahead with the military response after he weighed the proportionality of a drone versus 150 lives. I think the people in Iran will see his comments. His Twitter feed is read all over the world, and it might open up some opportunities for productive conversation. So, and that's not something that we've seen in the past from past presidents on both sides of the aisle. Frequently we do see a very significant response that kills a lot of people. And if it happened here, we would be outraged. But so I actually was a little surprised when I read his remarks today, and I think it's fruitful.
There are Iran war hawks in the administration. We look at John Bolton and Pompeo. And so that's...
And I don't think the president's one of those.
We'll see what happens there, of course. We'll be watching that and see how things are developing on a day-to-day basis at this point. Now, Democrats running for president take their first big test of the campaign this week. Debates, on back-to-back nights, Wednesday and Thursday. We'll have 10 candidates on stage. Elizabeth Warren, Beto O'Rourke, Amy Klobuchar, and Cory Booker have the strongest poll numbers for that first night. They're among those in the picture. Night number 2 has the 2 biggest heavyweights so far in Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris also polling better than most of the field. 3 candidates who didn't make the cut are Montana Governor Steve Bullock, Congressman Seth Moulton, and Mayor Wayne Messam of Florida. Now, I don't believe in polls at this stage of the campaign, but they were relevant in determining who actually qualified for the debates. This will be a fight for the microphone. How hard will it be for the candidates to distinguish themselves with 10 on stage each night? Is being aggressive a winning strategy? I'm sure you've been involved in some debate strategies in your involvement in presidential campaigns, Steve.
Yes, so first of all, kudos to the Democrats for splitting this up into 2 somewhat randomly select. Yes,
yeah, not the tier structure.
Okay. The way we did it in the Republican campaign 3 years ago is
hurt some of those lesser tier candidates.
Terrible, and so this is a much better way to give everybody a fair shot. And you want to give everybody a shot, not just those that are front runners today, because that changes so significantly. Who would have thought at this point in the election that Trump would do so well in the Republican primary? Not many people did. So you want to make sure you're giving people a good hear. And so I like what they're doing, and it'll be really interesting to actually watch these. And I hope the president live tweets it, because that would be very entertaining.
And as a Republican, you'll be watching too, I would assume, right?
You'll
be interested.
Probably, I don't know if I'll watch both nights, but I'll keep an eye on it.
Is it about being aggressive, though, to really make a point here? Because there's going to be a fight for airtime.
Well, I think there is going to be an effort to try to set oneself apart from the crowd, and it is a crowd. I mean, it's interesting on 2 levels. First of all, it seems anybody who's a Democrat is running this year. And second of all, it probably says something about the concern or the feeling that Trump is very vulnerable, that so many people have crowded the field. Usually when you've got an incumbent running, there's a little bit less of a field running in opposition. But I do think it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. Some of the candidates, like Mayor Pete from South Bend, I don't think was considered to be a very strong candidate because of his relatively limited background politically, but he's really kind of risen up through the polls. More recently, Elizabeth Warren's been moving through the ranks, and of course, former Vice President Biden and Bernie Sanders are 2 others that are sort of ahead of the pack.
And they're the targets, though, of course. In a
That's right, which will be real interesting to see. I think you're going to see a lot of shaking out probably in the next 2 months with some of the candidates who've declared withdrawing because they simply don't see a path.
Steve Grubbs, Mark Schweber, great stuff as always from you too. That brings us to our question of the week. What do you think the United States should do about the rising tension with Iran? Send your answer by email to fortherecord@whbf.com or respond to this post on Facebook at the Local 4 News WHBF TV page or on my page.